The train rolled in with a low groan, iron wheels screeching against frozen rails, sending up sparks as it fought the final stretch into town. Smoke bled from its stack, curling against the winter sky, heavy and gray as though it carried every mile it had traveled on its back. When it hissed to a stop, dust rose in slow spirals, settling over boots, over boards, over the few faces gathered near the platform. The air was sharp enough to bite, but no one lingered long. Most men came only to collect a crate or tip their hat to a passing conductor. This was not the sort of town where people stood around waiting for stories to unfold. She stepped down without hesitation, though the step was tall enough that her skirt caught at her boots. A small suitcase dangled from her hand, its leather worn smooth from years of travel and touch. The letter was folded neatly inside, pressed flat between her gloves and the lining of her coat. She didn't need to check the words again, she knew them by heart. Promises written in a plain but steady hand, words that had felt like a door opening when she read them by lamplight weeks ago. A man of good land, looking for a wife. Honest work, no frills, just grit and steady hands. Her chin lifted against the cold. She was short, and she knew it. In her childhood, her brothers had teased her for standing on crates to reach shelves, for running with quick steps that never seemed to cover as much ground as theirs. Even now, when she walked through crowds, she disappeared behind shoulders, but she had never thought height made her less. She carried strength in her arms, years of laundry tubs and scrub brushes, and lifting what others left too heavy. Her hands bore the proof cracked at the knuckles, dark bruises settling along the nail beds, palms rubbed raw from rope and wood and iron. If anyone wanted proof of her worth, they only needed to look there. The station boards thudded under boots as others moved around her, men loading crates, a boy chasing after a loose paper caught in the wind, a woman hurrying two children along with hands clutched too tightly. No one offered her help with the suitcase, no one asked her name, but she didn't mind. Names meant little until they were proven. She drew in a breath that came out in a pale puff, her lashes wet with snowflakes, and turned her face toward the town. It was small, smaller than she had imagined. A crooked church steeple leaned westward as if the wind had been pushing at it for years. A saloon stood a little off-center, its door swinging loose, laughter spilling out before the cold swallowed it again. A single sign creaked above the general store, its letters faded, half vanished by weather. And yet, in that moment, it looked to her like something more. A place where ground might finally soften, where life could mean more than endless days bent over water and fire. Her steps were sure, though each one seemed to press heavier than the last. Not from fear that had long since been burned out of her, but from hope, which weighed more. Hope for a place to belong, hope that the letter she carried meant more than paper. She clutched her suitcase tighter, her free hand brushing over the pocket where the folded promise rested, and told herself that no matter what waited, she had not come this far to turn back. He was waiting just beyond the crowd, a figure cut neat and sharp against the sway of the saloon doors and the tilt of the sheriff's office roof. His coat was pressed, his boots shined brighter than the weather called for, and his hat sat just so brim, lowered as if shading eyes that had learned to measure before they welcomed. When she spotted him, her breath caught in a small, steadying pause. She had carried his letter across 2 territories, the words promising work and companionship tucked close to her ribs like a flame against cold nights. Now here he was, not in ink but in flesh, and she straightened her shoulders, tightened her grip on the suitcase handle, and took those last few steps toward him with a heart-hammering hope against bone. His eyes swept over her in one swift glance, up and down like a merchant taking stock, and something in his mouth tightened. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't lift her bag. He just looked, then shook his head slow, the kind of motion that carried disappointment deeper than words. "This is a mistake," he said flatly, his voice carrying enough to turn the heads of those nearest. She blinked, words caught behind her lips. "2 came like you asked," she managed, her fingers brushing the pocket where the letter pressed its truth against her coat. You're not what I asked for. His gaze lingered at her shoulders, then dipped to the small set of her frame. I said I needed a woman who could stand beside me. Someone folks could look at and say, that's a rancher's wife. He tipped his head, voice hardening. You don't measure up. The words landed heavier than the suitcase dragging at her hand. Heat burned the edges of her face, not from shame alone but from the quiet ripple that moved through the platform. Men shifted against posts, women paused mid-step, and the boy who had chased his paper earlier stopped with wide eyes. The town had turned into a jury without words, their silence as loud as any gavel. I can work, she said finally, voice low but firm. Harder than most, harder than any porcelain doll you'd bring in just to sit pretty. He gave a short laugh, empty of kindness. I asked for grit, not rough. A woman can sweat behind closed doors, but she ought to look proper where eyes can see. You're too small, too plain, it won't do. He didn't say ugly, but the word hung thick between them, a ghost no one needed to name. Her chest tightened, but she lifted her chin. I crossed 2 territories to get here. Spent everything I had. Not my problem, he answered, shrugging as if she were no more than dust on his sleeve. He tipped his hat without warmth, turned on his polished heel, and walked away. No one stopped him. No one stopped her either. The silence of the street held her there, every stare pressing into her back, every whisper barely hidden behind palms. She didn't cry. Not then, not when the train's whistle screamed its departure behind her, not when the dust of his rejection settled into her hair. She only swallowed once, hard enough to burn, and told herself her bones were made of something stronger than their looks. The crowd drifted back to life slowly, like nothing had happened, though she felt marked by it, branded by his words and their silence. She set her suitcase down, pressed her hand to her pocket where the letter had lost all its weight, and stood taller than her size allowed. If they thought her too small, let them. She would not bend, not here, not now. She turned toward the street with her breath sharp in the winter air, and began walking, not toward him, but away, because she knew the only way forward was to prove not to them. Then to herself that worth had nothing to do with inches. The street stretched long and uneven, dust crusted over frozen ground, each step of her boots sounding louder than it should have. People had gone back to their errands, but she could feel them still, eyes brushing her shoulders as though her size and her shame could not be separated. She carried her suitcase in one hand, the leather biting against her palm, her other hand pressed tight against her coat pocket, where the folded letter lay useless now, just ink on paper with no promise left. She walked with her chin up, because if she lowered it even once, she feared the weight of the day would fold her to her knees. The boarding house came into view at the end of the street, 2 stories of clapboard with lace curtains yellowed by time, a carved sign swinging on rusty chains. She stopped a moment, drawing in a breath to steady herself, then climbed the steps. The door opened on a parlor that smelled faintly of lemon oil and coal. Behind the desk sat a woman with sharp eyes and a mouth that had practiced turning strangers away. I need a room, she said quietly, setting her suitcase at her feet. The woman's gaze traveled over her like she was measuring not money but character, pausing at the frayed edges of her shawl, the tired boots, the smallness of her frame. Rooms here are for families, the woman said at last, or girls with husbands to vouch for them. I can pay. She reached into her pocket and laid down the few coins she had left, their clink too thin against the wood. The woman didn't look at them. A woman alone draws the wrong sort of talk. I keep a decent house. Her lips pressed tight around the word decent, as if it were a blade she held to cut others away. Her chest tightened, but she refused to let the woman see her falter. She gathered the coins back, nodded once as though the refusal had been expected, and lifted her suitcase. Thank you anyway. Outside, the air struck colder than before, not because the temperature had dropped, but because the door had closed firmly behind her. She stood for a long moment on the step, the sky dimming above, then turned toward the market square. her stomach knotted with emptiness, sharp and low. At the bakery stall, a boy no older than 12 stood behind the counter, flour still clinging to his fingers. She placed her last coin in his palm. "Whatever this buys." He looked at her once, then ducked behind the table and returned with a crust of bread, no bigger than his fist, rough-edged and already stale. She took it without complaint, broke it in half, and ate slow, letting each bite soften before she swallowed. The taste was dry, but it was something to keep her standing. When night fell, she carried herself toward the post office, its back wall offering a sliver of shelter against the wind. She sat with her knees pulled close, suitcase tucked beside her, the hard ground biting through her skirt. She wrapped her shawl tighter, lifted her face to watch her own breath rise in pale clouds, and let the cold settle over her. She thought of home, not with longing, but with the hollow knowing that it wasn't there for her anymore. She thought of the man at the station, of the sharp cut of his words, and told herself she would not carry them any longer than she must. Shame pressed heavy, but she held her chin high, because dignity was the last thing she had, and she would not let this town take it from her, too. By morning, frost laced her hair silver, and her hands were stiff from the cold. Still, she rose, dusted herself off, and walked toward the bakery again, the hunger in her belly less sharp than the hunger in her heart. Work, she told herself, just find work. Keep standing, keep moving. And so she did, each step firm despite the ache, carrying herself like a woman who refused to disappear. The bakery smelled of yeast and ash, a mixture that clung to the air long after the ovens had cooled. When she stepped inside, the warmth brushed her cheeks, but it was not hers to keep. The front counter gleamed with sweet rolls and sugared buns, but behind it lay buckets and soot-stained cloths stacked like an unspoken sentence. The baker's wife eyed her from beneath a kerchief, lips pursed, arms folded across an apron too clean to know the kind of work she was about to hand over. "You're small," the woman said, as if the truth needed pointing out. "Half a woman, half a day's strength. I ought to send you along." Her eyes narrowed, voice cutting sharper. "But my floors are filthy, and dirt don't care if the hands that clean it are short or tall. You'll scrub, that's all." She nodded once, steady, and dropped her suitcase near the back wall. Kneeling, she dipped the rag into cold water and set to work. The boards were blackened with years of soot, ash packed into the grooves like stubborn secrets. The cloth tore after a few strokes, but she knotted it back together and pressed harder, her knuckles raw against wood. The hours stretched long, broken only by the hiss of ovens and the sharp snap of orders tossed her way. "Buckets low. You missed a spot. Scrub harder, girl." The counter girl, young and pale, leaned against the doorframe to watch, a smirk playing at her lips. "She'll wear herself down to bone before supper," she whispered loud enough for her to hear. The baker's wife laughed, shaking flour from her hands. "Let her. She came short and will leave shorter." Their words pricked, but she swallowed them like stones, letting them sink deep where they could not shift her hands. Her body bent, her palms burned, her knees ached against the boards, yet she moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had lived by work and would continue to. Sweat beaded along her hairline, rolling down to sting her eyes, but she did not pause. The bucket darkened with filth, proof that her labor meant something, even if no one would say so aloud. By evening, her arms trembled with the strain, yet the floors shone in patches where ash had been lifted. She sat back on her heels for a moment, stretching her cramped fingers, and caught her reflection faintly in the sheen of wet wood. Not elegant, not delicate, but steady, and for a flicker of a second she let that be enough. The baker himself barely glanced her way when he returned from the ovens, his hands full of loaves, steaming in their pans. "She'll do," he muttered to his wife, as though she were no more than another tool for the shop. His wife sniffed. "For scrubbing, maybe, nothing more." That night, she left with her shawl damp from the buckets, her fingernails rimmed black, her body aching from the crawl across every inch of the floor. She passed the lamp-lit windows of the town, where other women leaned back in chairs, sewing with soft hands and voices light as sugar. She did not envy them. She only held her chin higher because while the baker's wife might call her half a woman, she knew she had given twice the labor anyone else would. She returned to her place behind the post office, unwrapped the crust of bread she'd saved, and ate it slowly, letting the crumbs fall into her lap. The ache in her hands throbbed, but it was an honest ache, the kind born of survival, and she wrapped herself in that as though it were a blanket. Tomorrow she would scrub again. Tomorrow she would not bend, not break. Tomorrow she would keep standing, even on her knees. The first time she noticed him, it was not because he spoke or moved toward her, but because he didn't look away. Most men let their eyes linger too long, or else turned their faces quickly, as though her small frame and roughened hands were something they needn't trouble themselves with. But this mantle, broad at the shoulders, hat pulled low simply, regarded her with the kind of quiet attention that did not strip her dignity, nor burden her with pity. He was leaning against a post near the well while she hauled up a bucket heavy enough to bow the rope. Her arms strained, her back bent, but she set her jaw and pulled until the water sloshed over the sides and wet her boots. When she straightened, breath sharp in her chest, she caught his eyes. He gave a small nod, not of approval, not of judgment, but of recognition, then turned back to his horse without a word. The town had already marked him as strange, she'd heard. A rancher who kept to himself, who spoke only when needed, who lived past the ridge where the grass grew long and the wind sharper. Folks said he was solitary by choice, that he carried his land like a shield and let no one past its fence line. To her, he simply seemed steady, the kind of man who did not waste words because he did not waste much at all. Days passed, and she kept scrubbing floors at the bakery, her hands red from water and ash, her knees swollen from boards that offered no softness. The baker's wife sneered often, reminding her that half a woman makes half the work. But still she carried buckets, lifted sacks, scrubbed ovens blackened from years of neglect. And sometimes, when she bent over a bucket in the yard or swept the stoop with her shawl tugged tight against the wind, she felt his presence near the edge of the street. He never lingered long, never offered comment, just looked, then looked away, as if making certain she had not vanished into the cracks of the town. One evening, returning to the narrow space behind the post office where she laid her head, she found a bundle of firewood stacked neat beside the wall. Not much, just enough for one night's warmth, but cut clean, tied with twine. She touched it with careful fingers, half expecting it to vanish like something imagined. No note lay beside it, no explanation, but she knew. The next night, another small bundle appeared, this one with bark still fresh, the kind of wood that promised longer heat. She lit it slowly, the smoke curling skyward, and warmed her hands until the ache in her bones eased. Later, she discovered a loaf of bread wrapped in paper tucked beside the steps of the bakery. The counter girl laughed, assuming someone had forgotten it. But when she unwrapped the crust and found it fresh, unsold, she thought of the way he'd once tipped his hat without speaking. She ate each slice sparingly, not because she doubted more would come, but because she wanted the kindness to last. He never announced himself. He never asked anything in return. Yet the rhythm of his quiet gestures grew into a pattern she could not ignore. Wood when the nights turned colder, bread when her wages fell short. Once, even a small packet of salt, wrapped in cloth, left where only she would find it. And though the town whispered about her size, her lack, her unworthiness, she felt the edges of those words soften, if only within herself. Because somewhere in the silence, a man had chosen to see not what she lacked, but what she carried. The day had been long before it even began. The ovens burned hotter than usual, their heat spilling into every corner of the bakery until the walls themselves seemed to sweat. Ash clung thick in the air, mixing with flour until every breath tasted like grit. She had been on her knees since sunrise, scrubbing soot that never seemed to vanish, only smear from black to gray. Her hands were raw, nails rimmed dark, skin split in places where water had chewed through the last of her calluses. Still, she kept moving, rag in one hand, bucket dragged from room to room, the ache in her back a steady companion. The baker's wife barked orders from the counter, her voice sharp as glass. "Faster, girl. You think dirt waits for you? Half a woman ought to work twice as hard just to keep up." The counter girl giggled behind a hand, the sound high and cruel. She ignored them both, as she always did, because their words could not scrub a single floorboard. She pressed harder, her shoulders trembling, her vision narrowing each time she bent and rose again. By mid-afternoon, her arms felt as though they had been hollowed out. She reached for another bucket, lifted it too quickly, and the room tilted. Heat pressed against her temples, the air thickening until it carried no oxygen at all. The rag slipped from her fingers. A sharp noise filled her ears like the rush of a river too close, and then the boards rushed up to meet her. When she woke, the world was cold again. The sting of winter air kissed her cheeks, and her lashes fluttered open to a sky pale and wide. She was no longer on the bakery floor but outside, her back resting against the stoop, a coat draped heavy over her shoulders. It smelled faintly of horse and cedar, not of flour or ash. Her fingers curled into the fabric before she even thought to. He was there, sitting on the porch rail as though carved into it, his hat tilted low, hands resting loose on his knees. The rancher. His gaze wasn't on her, but on the horizon, steady, patient, as though time itself bent around his silence. "You fainted," he said after a moment, his voice quiet, carrying no judgment. "Could have cracked your head on the stove." Her throat felt raw, her lips dry, but she managed a small nod. The weight of exhaustion pressed at every bone, yet for once it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like her body had demanded the rest she never granted it. He gestured toward the pail set beside her. "Water's there, drink before you stand." She reached for it, her hands shaking, and sipped. The water was cool, cutting through the cotton in her throat. When she set it down, she found him watching, not in pity, not like the town's eyes that measured and mocked, but as though her collapse had proven nothing against her. "Rest before you go back," he said simply, turning his gaze forward again. The words were plain, but they carried more mercy than any kindness she had known in years. Not spoken as an order, not wrapped in scorn, just given as if her life had value enough to protect. She swallowed hard, not from thirst this time, but from something rising in her chest that felt too large for words. She leaned back against the wall, the coat holding warmth where her own body had lost it, and let the silence between them settle. It was not heavy. It was not cruel. It was the first silence in a long time that did not demand her to shrink. For the first time since stepping off the train, she felt herself seen not as small, not as rough, not as a mistake, but as someone who mattered enough for a man to stay and keep watch until her strength returned. The next time he spoke to her, it was not in the heat of concern but in the plain tone of a man asking a simple question. She was scrubbing the bakery stoop when his shadow stretched across the boards. She looked up, half expecting him to leave a bundle of wood or bread as he sometimes did, silent offerings left like secrets. Instead, he tipped his hat slightly and said, "You know how to mend a hinge?" The question startled her. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because no one had ever asked it of her, as if her hands were meant for more than scrubbing and carrying. She blinked once, then nodded. "I've tried." He gave a slow nod in return. "Mine's sticking, if you've time." He didn't wait for her to explain herself, didn't doubt her, just stepped aside as though the choice belonged entirely to her. She dried her hands on her skirt, tucked the rag into the bucket, and followed. His ranch stretched wide across the ridge, quiet and unadorned, a place built not for show but for endurance. The fence posts leaned in places, the barn carried scars from storms, and the house stood square and weathered, its porch sagging slightly but still holding. She liked it immediately. It looked like something that had endured and survived, much like herself. He led her inside without ceremony, gesturing toward the crooked door that hung just enough off its hinge to scrape against the frame. A small toolbox sat open nearby, and he stepped back as though to grant her space. She knelt, fingers tracing the worn screw, and reached for the driver without needing to ask where it was. The tool fit roughly in her hand, the wood handle pressing into cracked skin, but her fingers moved with the surety of someone who had fixed what she could with little more than will. "Not many women know how to do that," he remarked after a moment, his voice steady, not mocking, just observing. She kept her eyes on the screw, twisting slow and deliberate. "Most women don't get the chance." He didn't answer right away, but the silence shifted, less distance, more listening. When the hinge finally gave a smoother swing, she pushed the door closed and opened it again, satisfied by the even glide. She wiped her hands on her skirt and looked up. He gave another of those small nods, approval tucked quiet in the corner of his mouth. She stayed longer than she'd meant to. There was soot on the hearth, and her fingers itched to wipe it clean. There was a trough that needed filling, feed sacks stacked heavier than his fence posts, and without thinking, she set to work. He didn't stop her, didn't tell her it wasn't her place, only moved alongside her, carrying what needed carrying, cooking when dusk settled. His food was simple biscuits too hard, eggs too soft, but he set them before her with the kind of plain honesty that needed no apology. She ate every bite, not because it was fine, but because it was given with care. When she rose to leave, he walked her to the gate. He didn't ask her to come again. He didn't need to. Something in the ease of their silence had already planted itself between them. Not love, not yet, but respect that took root deeper than words. She carried it with her on the walk back, her hands aching less than usual, her heart carrying a weight that for once did not feel like burden. The whispers began as soon as her footsteps became familiar on the ranch road. She could feel them in the way heads leaned together when she passed the mercantile, in the sudden hush when she entered the church, in the long glances that stretched over her shoulders like shadows she could not shake. "She's too short," one woman murmured behind a basket of laundry. "Too plain," another added near the well. "Clawing for what ain't hers," the baker's wife declared, her voice sharp enough to carry. The words fell like stones, meant to bruise, but she did not bow beneath them any more. She had once flinched under silence, under scorn, but the steady rhythm of her days with him had taught her something different. Respect had been planted in the quiet work they shared, her hands fixing what he left undone, his presence steady beside her when the weight grew too heavy. She carried that with her now, an armor not made of iron, but of dignity. When she walked through town with a basket of mended linens, she kept her chin level, her eyes forward, her steps even. The words stung, of course they did, but they no longer bent her spine. He did not speak of the whispers. He never needed to. When she paused outside the store, clutching her basket tighter against the sting of laughter, he stepped from the shadows of the feed shed and fell into stride beside her. He didn't reach for her hand, didn't announce his presence, simply matched her pace, his long steps slowed to hers. The street seemed quieter for it, the voices less certain. A man who ignored rumor had more power than one who fought it, and his silence cut deeper than any defense. They passed the saloon together, boots loud on the boardwalk, her shoulders squared against the weight of so many eyes. He didn't look at her, but he didn't look away either. That steadiness gave her strength. She felt taller walking beside him, as if the world could no longer shrink her to less than she was. That evening, after returning to her narrow room and lighting the small lamp that smoked more than it glowed, she found something tucked against the step. A sprig of wildflowers, stems bound with twine, petals bent but still bright against the gray of the dirt. No note, no explanation, just a gesture. She touched them with careful fingers, the fragile blooms softer than anything her hands had known in months, and felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't a declaration, not even a promise, just proof that someone had thought of her without asking for anything in return. She placed the flowers in an old tin cup and set them on the sill, where the fading light caught their color. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to smile, just enough for her lips to tremble with the effort. Outside, the gossip might rage, but here, in this small space, she carried something louder than words. The knowledge that she had been seen, and that someone's silence could speak more tenderly than all the town's chatter combined. The news of his return traveled faster than the train whistle that carried him back. By the time she reached the square with her basket of mended linens, the town had already gathered in quiet knots, murmuring about the man who had once turned his back on her. He stepped off the platform with a polished air, boots gleaming, coat lined with fur that caught the light. Beside him walked a woman tall and elegant, her hair shining like spun silk, her dress stitched fine enough to catch every eye. They looked like they had walked straight out of a photograph meant to be admired, not lived in. He spotted her almost at once. His lips curled into the same smirk he had worn that first day at the station, the one that cut deeper than any blade. He slowed his steps, ensuring every head turned, ensuring the crowd leaned in to catch his words. "Well, if it ain't the mistake come back to haunt me," he drawled, his voice carrying across the boardwalk. His bride gave a sharp, high laugh that pricked like needles. "I told you," he went on, "God made some things too small, and you were one of them." The words cracked through the air like a whip. A hush fell over the crowd. Some laughed nervously, others shifted uneasily, but no one spoke. She stood still, her basket pressed against her ribs, her knuckles white against the handle. Her chest burned, not from shame this time, but from the fury that rose like fire. She parted her lips to speak, to strike back with the truth she had carried in silence for too long. But before the words could leave her, another voice cut through, deep, steady, unhurried, yet thunderous in its certainty. "She's more than enough." The crowd turned, a ripple moving through the square as the rancher stepped forward. Dust clung to his boots, sawdust marked his sleeves, but his presence filled the space with a weight no polished coat could match. His eyes fixed on the suitor, calm but unyielding, as though daring him to speak again. "She's steady," he went on, his voice dropping into the hush like a hammer striking iron. "She's strong, stronger than anyone here gives her credit for." He shifted, closing the space until he stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, his stance solid and unshakable. Then he looked down at her, not at the crowd, not at the man who had mocked her, but at her, his words turning softer yet sharper still. "She's mine if she'll have me." It was not shouted, it was not dressed in poetry or grand gesture, but it rolled through the square with the force of a storm breaking open, undeniable and absolute. Her breath caught. The crowd seemed to vanish, their whispers swallowed by the thrum in her chest. All she saw was him, his steadiness, his certainty, his refusal to let her stand alone. For a heartbeat, she could not move. Then her chin lifted, her eyes steady on his. The shame that had once bent her now broke apart like smoke in the wind. The suitor scoffed, his laughter brittle. "You'll regret claiming half a woman," he sneered. But the words carried no strength anymore. Not when the rancher's voice still echoed, not when the weight of his truth stood like iron beside her. She didn't answer the suitor. She didn't need to. The silence between her and the man at her side was louder than mockery, stronger than laughter. And for the first time since stepping off the train, she felt not like a mistake, but like someone chosen not by pity, not by desperation, but by a man who had looked straight into her and seen her worth. The square held its breath after his words, as if the dust itself had paused midair to wait for her answer. She didn't tremble, didn't bow her head or let tears claim her cheeks the way some might have expected. Instead, she drew in one long, steady breath and turned to him. His hand hung loose at his side, not demanding, not reaching, simply there if she wanted it. She lifted her chin, placed her small, cracked hand into his, and felt the quiet strength in his palm. Her voice came clear, unshaken, sharp enough to slice through every whisper that had haunted her since stepping off the train. "I'll stand with you," she said, eyes locked to his, "because you saw me when no one else did." Gasps rippled through the crowd, the sound of surprise and disbelief mingling with the crunch of boots shifting uneasily on the boards. The suitor's polished smile faltered, his tall bride pulling at his sleeve as though to drag him away from a fight already lost. The rancher didn't so much as glance at them. His hand tightened around hers, not as possession but as promise, and with that, the confrontation ended. The crowd dispersed slowly, like a storm rolling off the ridge, but the silence they left behind carried a new weight. She was no longer the girl mocked for her size. She was the woman who had stood and been chosen openly, not rescued, but recognized. The days that followed were not filled with declarations or grand displays, but with the quiet building of something sturdier. She moved her few belongings into the small house on his land, setting her tin sewing box on a shelf, her ribbon folded carefully beside it. The place did not suddenly bloom into romance, it remained what it had always been, a weathered cabin with walls that creaked in the wind, floors that needed sweeping, and hinges that asked for oil. But now there was another chair pulled to the table, another pair of boots by the door, and laughter soft, rare, but real that rose sometimes when she burned bread or when his biscuits turned out like stones. They built their life not with riches, but with mornings that began before the sun, fences mended side by side, and the rhythm of labor that turned from survival into companionship. She baked loaves that grew less lopsided with practice. He brought in firewood stacked high enough to last through storms. They learned the weight of each other's silences, how to share them without crowding. He never treated her as too little. He trusted her to haul, to mend, to carry her share, and in that trust she found her shoulders straighter, her steps firmer. Evenings came soft. She would knead dough at the table while he whittled at small scraps of wood, his rough hands turning cedar into doves and sparrows. Sometimes he'd leave one by her plate without a word, and she would place it on the shelf beside the tin box, the collection growing slowly, each piece a quiet testament to the days behind them. There were no vows spoken, no church bells rung, only the slow weaving of lives into one. Respect deepened into tenderness, tenderness into love, not born in a blaze but in the steady warmth of shared breath on cold mornings, the brushing of hands when passing tools, the unspoken relief of not being alone. She was never treated as half of anything again. She was whole, and he stood with her not because she had been remade into something else, but because she had always been enough. And when the town whispered now, their voices carried less sting. For every word of doubt, there was the sight of her walking beside him, chin lifted, her hand resting in his without apology. For every sneer, there was bread baking in their kitchen, fences standing taller, a garden planted in earth once thought barren. They had built not a castle, not a fairy tale, but a home stitched from labor and trust. And in the quiet of that home, love grew not measured in inches or appearances, but in worth, in steadiness, in the courage of being truly seen.